Hello. In this video blog, I want to cover the new auth authentication and authorization infrastructure introduced in MobileFirst Platform 7.0. Okay, so this is probably going to be one long video. Okay, so I'll split it to two parts. The first one will be mostly theoretical, and the second one will be mostly practical. Okay, so let's begin with the theoretical part. So let's understand what exactly I'm trying to achieve here. Okay, so I'm not going to explain too much about auth and about specifics of using it. Okay, I'm going to cover several scenarios that are possible to implement when using previous versions of MobileFirst Platform Foundation. Okay, I mean security authentication scenarios. Okay, I'm going to cover very in a nutshell what auth is and what problems does it solve. Okay, so then I'm going to cover exactly the same scenarios we've seen previously, but how auth can actually help resolving problems that might arise during those scenarios, right? And then we will see how to actually implement all of that, how to protect various types of resources with auth. Okay, so we will definitely not learn everything about auth, but I hope to cover a lot in this video and hope it will be useful and instrumental for you. So without further ado, let's start. Okay, so once again, what I'm planning to cover. How things worked prior to auth, which basically means prior to MobileFirst Foundation 7.0. What is auth in a nutshell, right? Understanding the auth flows and the reasoning behind those flows. Now, then we'll go back to MobileFirst Platform auth. We'll understand how this auth model is implemented in MobileFirst Platform. We'll cover several scenarios leveraging auth security model. I'll show you some additional links that you can follow to actually learn more about this, and eventually we'll do some live demo of how this works. Okay, so let's begin. So how things works prior to auth, prior to MobileFirst Platform 7.0. Now, it's not like things have changed or we deprecated. You can still implement everything I'm going to describe here, right? But during my description, I will also talk about problems that were prior to 7.0. Okay, and then I'm going to talk about how you can actually solve those problems with auth. So before auth, okay, let's see the very basic scenario. Right, so you have a client, you have probably a firewall protecting your internal infrastructure, there is a MobileFirst Platform server, right, and there is some kind of a backend that actually stores your data. So the very basic scenario would be something like your client makes a request to MobileFirst Platform, right? MobileFirst Platform detects that this request is not authorized yet, so it sends back challenges. Okay, and those challenges might include user authentication, device authentication, application authentication, multiple various different challenges. Client gathers all the credentials it needs to gather. It might be username and password or anything else, and it sends back challenge responses, right? MobileFirst Platform validates those challenge responses, and it might use backend to actually validate credentials like username and password, right? So in this case, you see on the screen, backend actually says success, username and password were successful. So MobileFirst Platform will notify client that authentication was successful. So client will automatically make a new request, not the new request, it will automatically send the original request, this time for authenticated session. MobileFirst at this phase knows that this client is authenticated, right? So it will go to the backend and it will ask for data. So backend will return data and MobileFirst will return this data back to client. So this is a very standard, very basic scenarios with no complexities whatsoever. Okay, so I'm assuming at this point that you are familiar with MobileFirst authentication concepts like challenge handler and realm and adapter-based authentication, for example. So I'm not going to cover any technical details of those. I'm assuming you're familiar with those, right? So this is a very, very basic flow that can be easily implemented using MobileFirst Platform, right? So in some cases, your backend, your infrastructure might differ a little bit. Okay, so you might have a separate server, separate entity that actually takes care of your authentication, like authentication manager, or some kind of a user registry, or LDAP server or anything else that you might have inside of your enterprise, right? And you have separately a backend. Okay, so in this case, the credential validation will be actually done against your user registry or authentication manager, and once you're authenticated, once you're approved, the MobileFirst platform will actually allow you to get data from backend. Okay, so as once again, this is a very basic scenario. You don't see it too often in big enterprises. Big enterprises usually require more security. Okay, so that's why let's take a look at a more advanced scenario. So in this more advanced scenario, you have client, and instead of a firewall, you have an authentication gateway, right? So we're going to talk about authentication gateway in a moment. So in addition to authentication gateway, you have a separate entity, a server that's actually responsible for authentication. And this might be some kind of a user registry. It might be LDAP server that you configure. So basically, it's a entity responsible for maintaining user registry and actually validating credentials against it. So in addition, you still have MobileFirst platform server, right? And you have a backend, and your goal is to actually get data from that backend. So initially, client makes request to the authentication gateway. So authentication gateway is a layer that actually intercepts all requests and decides whether this request is allowed to proceed or not. There are many various types of authentication gateways. You have data power that can serve as authentication gateway. It can do much more, but authentication gateway, that's one of the things that data power can do, IBM appliance. You have other types of authentication gateways like SiteMinder, WebSeal, ISAM, F5, multiple different types of authentication gateways exist, and in addition, each one of those can be configured to work in many different ways. Okay, so for purpose of this video, I would actually assume that we have a standard, some kind of a standard authentication gateway that uses cookies to authenticate users, to detect authenticated users. Okay, so once again, it starts with client making request to authentication gateway, right? Authentication gateway detects that this client is not authenticated yet, so it will not allow it to this request to proceed to the enterprise, to the internal components of the enterprise. It will instead send login form back to client. Okay, so client, usually using challenge handler, knows how to detect this login form. Client will collect credentials, and it will send credentials to the authentication gateway, right? Authentication gateway detects this session is not authenticated yet, but it knows that, okay, so client is trying to send me credentials. So authentication gateway actually goes to that authentication manager or user registry entity and tries to validate those credentials, and it will get either success or failure. So let's assume authentication gateway received success. So authentication gateway creates a cookie. Okay, some kind of a access token for, if you're familiar with various types of authentication gateways, it might be LTPA token, or it might be any other type of like SAML token. Okay, but in general, I'm not going too deep into details of authentication gateways. I'm assuming that eventual authentication gateway creates some kind of a cookie that contains access token that will allow client to proceed with his request. Okay, so everything that was before that I've made transparent, okay, because that's a separate flow and we're not concerned about it too much as of now. So at this phase, client has cookie. Okay, this access token is a cookie. So he makes the request once again, this time with cookie inside of that request. Okay, bundled with the request. So authentication gateway will detect this cookie, might validate it, might do some additional stuff with it. Okay, but eventually it will let request in. Okay, it will let request through, since this cookie actually means that user have authenticated. Okay, so at this phase, your request has finally reached MobileFirst platform server, right? But now at this phase, MobileFirst platform server actually needs to know who this user is, right? Because MobileFirst platform probably needs to use adapters to call backend, and it needs a way to actually tell backend who is that user that's trying to get the data, right? MobileFirst platform needs to report analytics, so it also needs to know information about that specific user. Okay, however, it just has this cookie. okay, and mobile first platform not necessarily knows how to handle this cookie automatically, right? So in case you are using data power IBM appliance and you are using LTPA cookie, okay, LTPA token as a cookie, mobile first platform will know automatically how to handle it because mobile first platform knows how to work with LTPA tokens. Okay, but in case you're using some third-party authentication gateway, right? Mobile first platform doesn't know automatically what this cookie means. So developer might need to actually implement manually functionality that will allow mobile first platform to go to the user registry or authentication manager and actually find out what this cookie means, okay? Or some kind of additional functionality that will allow mobile first platform to actually parse this cookie and get some information from it, okay? So there are multiple ways here, but the idea is this is something that that developer will probably have to implement manually. So at next step, mobile first platform makes requests to backend, probably using adapters. Okay, so here we have more questions. Questions like, should developer manually get cookie from client request and add it to backend request, right? And this is assuming that backend actually knows how to handle that cookie. It knows how to handle that access token, right? Should mobile first platform use go to a user registry and get user identity from that cookie and send the user identity to that cookie? Should mobile first adapter use some kind of a system ID to actually go to the backend? So in this case, in case you're using authentication gateways, multiple various solutions are possible. Okay, so that's why it is important to know what exactly you're doing. It's important to know how your authentication gateway works, and it's important to know how you propagate user identity all the way back to your backend. And besides the fact that it's important to know, it's in most cases this will require some manual work. Okay, so we already seen some problems possible with this scenario. So not exactly problems, but some manual work might be required in those scenarios. Now, let's see a little bit more advanced scenario, okay? So it starts similar to previous one with Authentication Gateway, because Authentication Gateway does provide you a better security. It provides you with an excellent security. It makes sure that unauthenticated requests will never get through the gateway until user authenticates, right? But in this case, we have a new entity called web server. Okay, so it's a plain web server and it has PDF files. Okay, you can consider it as a backend, right? You can consider it as just another resource server on your infrastructure, right? So it has PDF files, and I'm intentionally saying PDF files here since PDF is a binary information. It's not JSON, it's not XML, it's not easy to parse. That's heavy binary information. Okay, so and of course client needs those PDF files. So what are the options here? Okay, and remember at this phase client is already authenticated and has the cookie to actually go through the authentication gateway. So one of the options is that client will make a request to the mobile first server and cookie will actually allow that request to come through, right? And mobile first server will make invocation directly to that PDF file, to the server hosting that PDF file. So once again, we have same questions here. Do we propagate the cookie that we receive from client all the way to that web server with PDF files? Are we assuming that that server actually knows how to handle this cookie, right? How do we handle the fact that we don't really know user identity at mobile first platform, well, assuming you're not using LTPA and data power? So same questions still exist here, but in addition you also have new questions. Should developer use adapter to actually do this invocation, right? So should developer manually tunnel all that binary data, okay, through the adapter? That might actually have some performance impact, right? Because you have one server and then you tunneling all the binary data through another server, okay? So it sounds like a possible performance impact. So, and again, how does that web server, it might be a brand new one, knows anything about the user that's trying to communicate with it, okay? So does it needs to go to Authentication Manager and User Register and actually ask who this user is, or how does it work, right? How does it knows about anything about that user? Okay. Another option is client actually making requests directly to that web server, right? And request, of course, contains cookie, that authentication cookie. But in this case, we have same questions. How does that web server knows what this cookie means? Okay, because it wasn't the one who created this cookie. Okay, so it needs to be integrated into your security infrastructure to actually being able to understand what this cookie means. Okay, because those PDF files, that's probably, let's say, user statements or user account statements, and you're required to specify your user identity before you can actually get one of those PDF files, right? Another question is, how do you get analytics for this? Okay, so you might have your some custom analytics infrastructure in your enterprise, right? But MobileFirst platform actually provides you a lot of analytics value. Okay, especially when you're using our SDKs, MobileFirst platform SDKs on a client and on a server, right? So still, we have more questions to answer. Okay. Let's take a look at even more advanced scenario. And in this even more advanced scenario, client is actually trying to make a request to some external PDF server in a cloud. Okay, so today cloud infrastructure is evolving really fast, and having some services in cloud, that's actually a valid solution for some cases. So let's assume client makes request to the external source in cloud, right? So this external server is absolutely external. It doesn't have any connectivity to your internal security infrastructure. That's cloud. You probably don't want to have a connectivity between cloud and your user registry unless you 100% sure that it's safe, right? So, but by default, that server doesn't know anything about authenticating your users, because your users are stored in your user registry, and that's a cloud server. So it doesn't know anything about your user registry, about your internal authentication infrastructure, so it just doesn't have a way to authenticate those requests. Let's assume client made multiple round trips with authentication gateway, authenticated, and got a cookie that actually means I'm authenticated. So if you're making a request with that cookie to the external PDF server, this cookie doesn't mean much. So the only entity here that this cookie means something for, that's authentication gateway, because authentication gateway uses this cookie to actually let your request inside of the infrastructure. But you're not even trying to get inside the enterprise infrastructure. You're making a request to external service in the cloud, right? So it doesn't know anything about that cookie, and it doesn't know anything about analytics. So it's not that easy to actually make a request making sure that you are authenticated to that external PDF server, okay, to external server in cloud, right? And getting all the value that you get when you're using MobileFirst platform. Okay, so let's talk about OAuth, okay? And in a nutshell, OAuth is about managing trust. Okay, so on a previous screen you've seen that the client is trying to make requests to the cloud server, and cloud server, by default, any server doesn't trust client and requires to authenticate first, right? So trust is something that you need to earn. You need a way to authenticate, and this way server will start trusting you. Okay, so OAuth is actually helping to overcome this trust problem. Okay, so once again, I'm not going to through a technical OAuth spec. I'm explaining OAuth in a nutshell. Okay, so with OAuth, you have three entities. You have a resource server that usually holds sensitive data, contains some sensitive data. You got a client that usually needs that sensitive data, right? It can be other way around. It can be client trying to upload some sensitive information, but anyway, clients need a way to authenticate. So usually it's download, so we'll take a look at the resource server that actually has the data and client that actually needs the data. And you also have authorization server. So authorization server is it's an entity that knows how to validate username and password and how to generate what's called access tokens. Okay, so when we're talking about resource server and client, the relationship between them, they do not trust each other by default, okay, from the start. So client doesn't trust resource server. It doesn't really know, doesn't necessarily know what this resource server is, okay, and it's very suspicious about providing that resource server with its username and password, okay. Resource server, on the other hand, doesn't really trust that client. So client will pretty soon ask for data from resource server, and resource server doesn't trust client enough to provide him with that data. And important thing is resource server doesn't really know how to authenticate that client. It doesn't know how to validate username and password. It's not connected to any user registry. It's just a resource. It's not authentication server. It's just a resource server. So it's not even planning to learn how to validate usernames and passwords, okay? So when looking at the client and authorization server segment, the relationship is a little bit different. Client absolutely trusts authorization server, okay? So client knows this specific authorization server, it knows that it can send it username and password, and authorization server will be able to validate it, okay? And if we look at the segment between resource server and authorization server, so you can say that resource server absolutely trusts authorization server. It's willing to accept its access tokens. Basically, it trusts it. Okay, so once authorization server will generate access token and give it to client, resource server is okay with working with that access token. Okay, and resource server also knows how to validate those access tokens, meaning checking that they are coming from the real authorization server that it trusts, they're not expired, they contain all the information, etc. Okay, so if we take a look in general, there is trust between authorization server and resource server. There is trust between authorization server and client, but there is no trust between resource server and client. Okay, and OAuth is actually about solving this problem: how to actually gain trust between resource server and client. So next we're gonna cover some flows, explaining how this OAuth works internally, right? But always keep in mind, we have two possible general scenarios. One of them is authorization server and resource server both being in internal enterprise infrastructure, right? So that was the scenario where the PDF server was inside of your enterprise. Okay, and only client is on public domain. So in this case, resource server and authorization server can communicate frequently. They trust each other much more. Okay, and it's a, let's say, more basic scenario, right? But there is also a possible scenario where resource server is also on a public domain. Okay, so only authorization server is part of the enterprise infrastructure, and both client and resource server are actually on a public domain. Okay, so it's not that easy, it's not that simple to do frequent communication between the resource server and authorization server, because now you have network latency between them. Okay, and it might take more time. So let's understand the flow, and keep in mind we're still in a nutshell, okay? We're still trying to just understand what OAuth actually means. So it all starts with client going to resource server and asking for data, okay? So this is not necessarily the beginning of the flow. Client can also start with going to authorization server and asking for permission for that data, but let's look at the simple scenario. Let's look at the most frequent scenario. Client goes to resource server asking for data. Resource server says, I don't trust you. Go ask for permission. So basically, resource server doesn't know who this client is, okay? It tells him, I don't trust you. I have no idea who you are. Go ask for permission, okay, for authorization. So client goes to authorization server asking, can I please access that resource server, okay? Authorization server, okay, who actually has access to user credentials, right, asks client to authenticate first, because authorization server also doesn't know who this client is, right? But unlike resource server, who doesn't know how to authenticate clients, authorization server actually does know how to authenticate clients. So he asks client to authenticate. Client authenticates. He's saying, I'm user 1, my password is ABCD1234, okay? So once credentials are validated, authorization server will authorize client to access that resource server. Okay, it will tell him, okay, authorize you to access resource server, and talking a little bit more technically, it will create an access token for client to use. Okay. So once client has this authorization, it will once again go to resource server saying, hey, look, I'm authorized, get me this data. Okay, and at this point resource server can actually go to authorization server and ask, is this user really authorized? Is this client really authorized, right? Authorization server can, of course, say yes or not. So authorization server will say, yeah, this one is authorized. That's the good access token. I've just created it. Okay, and once authorization server confirms that the client is okay, resource server will actually return data to the client. Okay. So it might look a little bit complex at the first look, right? But right now we're going to go through various flows provided to you when you use MobileFirst Platform Client SDK, and you will actually see that most of those requests are absolutely transparent to developer. Developer and user will never see them. It's handled internally by infrastructure, and it's very convenient to use. Okay, so let's get back to MobileFirst Platform OAuth. Okay. Before we go to sequence diagrams, let's take a look at definitions of two terms. So first one is authorization scope. Okay. And once again, I'm assuming you're familiar with MobileFirst platform security, with realms, with challenge handlers, and different types of authentication. Okay, so authorization scope, that's a list of realms that is defined in authentication config XML file on a MobileFirst server. Okay, so previously to 7.0, okay, you had a notion of security test, and security test actually contained multiple realms. Okay. Now, it's still the case in 7.0, but in addition to security test, with the auth allows you to define a scope. And scope, that's very easy. That's just a list of space-separated realms, okay, that your resource will be protected with. Okay, I will show you during the demonstration, I will show you exactly how it works. So, of course, it is possible to protect different resources with different scopes. Okay, so for example, you can have one scope, basic scope for getting a list of accounts, and a different scope for actually making a transaction. So in case you want to step up your authentication, you can have a basic credentials like just account number required to actually see the list of accounts, okay? And you might require some more advanced credential like PIN code or password for actually making a money transaction, okay? So this is possible. If not specified, application will be asked to authenticate with the default scope containing default MobileFirst platform realms, like anti-XSRF, anonymous user, etc. So this is very similar to the way MobileFirst platform worked before, prior to OAuth. Okay, so in case you do not specify any security checks manually, explicitly, the default ones will be used. Okay, so even if you're not specifying security, you have the basic protection provided by MobileFirst platform. Okay, so the second term is authorization header. Authorization header, that's actually that authorization information created by authorization server and used by client when it sends requests to a resource server. Okay, so authorization header contains two tokens. It contains access token that represents access and permissions of that specific user, okay? And it also contains an identity token that represents user and device and application identities, okay? So once once a resource server receives authorization header, it actually knows who this user is, who this device is, who this application is, right? And what are they allowed to access. So this is extremely convenient, and this helps to solve a lot of scenarios that we've seen previously. Now, authorization header and tokens inside of it are cumulative. So this means they always contain the latest state for all the authenticated realms. Okay, so if you authenticated with realm 1, you got your authorization header. Once you authenticate with realm 2, so now you're authenticated in 2 realms, right? You're just gonna get updated authorization header. It's not gonna be different one. It will be updated one that will contain the most updated information. Okay, so authorization header is injected and in general handled automatically when you use APIs provided by MobileFirst platform like WL resource request or WL client. Okay, so if you're using APIs provided by our SDK, you don't need to worry about all of those. Everything will be handled automatically, as you will see on following screenshots, following sequence diagrams. If you're not using WL resource requests, for example, in cases where you have your own HTTP infrastructure already in place, but you still want to leverage our MobileFirst platform OAuth infrastructure, you can still get all those authorization header and identity information manually by using WL Authorization Manager class. Okay. So moving next, let's see the auth flow when working with MobileFirst platform server and Java adapter. Java adapter, new feature introduced in 7.0. Okay, so green arrows here actually show the requests and responses made to Java adapter, which is considered a resource server. Java adapter is a resource server, right? And blue ones, that's the request response round trips to authorization server. So if you take a look, it all starts with SDK. From SDK, you're using WL resource request to make requests to Java adapter, right? Java adapter is protected by authentication filter, so authentication filter will actually intercept that request, and it will detect that this request doesn't have required authorization, right? So it will return a 401 response plus authorization scope. So authorization scope, that's your decision as a developer to actually how do you want to protect your Java adapter, the whole adapter, or every any method of it. Okay, so as we said, authorization scope, just a list of realms, just some string. And for one, that's HTTP status, meaning that client needs to authenticate. Okay, so client is not authorized. Okay, so the SDK will detect automatically that clients need to authorization information, and it will automatically trigger the authentication flow with authorization server. So it will ask authorization for scope that resource server actually requires. Okay, as a result, authorization server will take a look at all of those realms. As you recall, scope is a list of realms, and it will collect challenges from all of those realms. It will send those challenges to the client, and on client you have regular challenge handlers similar to pre 7.0. Nothing new here. You're already familiar with how those challenge handler works. Okay, I'm assuming that. So client needs to authenticate, client needs to collect credentials, it needs to report username and password, let's say, if you're talking about client user authentication, and eventually client will send challenge responses back to authorization server. So authorization server will generate authorization header and send it to client. And this will of course happen once all the credentials were successfully validated. So at this phase, client will once again make the original request, but this time with authorization header. Okay, so authorization filter will see that authorization header is present, it will validate it, it will see that everything is fine, and eventually it will return data from Java adapter. The resource server or Java adapter will return data. Okay, so this is a basic flow when working with Java adapters. Now note that only components highlighted with red, okay, currently outlined with red, are developer visible. Okay, so the rest, the transparent arrows, are all internal functionality, okay, and neither developer or user need to worry about that. So it all starts with developer making WL resource request to Java adapter. Okay, next thing developer knows, challenge handler might kick in. Okay, and developer will need to gather username and password and report this username and password, return them to the authentication framework, right? And eventually, in the end, developer will get his data. all of the internal flows are abstracted by WL resource request, so developer doesn't need to worry about that. It's very, very convenient to use this API. Right. So in this case, authorization filter and Java adapter are actually, the resource server is actually part of the MobileFirst platform server, right? But we want also to cover a more complex scenario like this, where we are working with external server. So it's not internal, it's external server anymore. External server now. So in 7.0, we provide, MobileFirst platform provides authorization filter as a standalone component that can be used on Node.js, Liberty, and WebSphere servers, right? So if you have your existing Node.js server or Liberty or WebSphere, you can take authorization filter provided by MobileFirst. You can install it on your system. It's very easy to configure. That's the demo I'm going to do pretty soon. Okay, and starting from that point, your external server is protected by MobileFirst authentication framework. Okay, so you don't need to teach your external server how to communicate with user registry. You don't need to teach it how to authenticate users. You don't need to create login forms or anything like it. Okay, authorization filter will do the job for you, as you will see. So in this case, flow is absolutely the same. Okay, the only difference is that red arrows are pointing in another direction. Once again, green arrows. So once again, WL resource request goes to external server, right? And authentication filter intercepts it, okay, and returns for 1 plus authorization scope. So this means this client is not authenticated, not authorized to access this service yet, okay. SDK will detect that, hey, now we need to get authorization information. It will ask authorization server for authorization information for that specific scope. Authorization server will return challenges. Challenge handler will handle those challenges and return challenge responses. And eventually authorization server will give you authorization header. So once this happens, the SDK will automatically make original request, this time with authorization header, and authorization filter will validate that header and allow requests to actually go through and return data. Okay, so it's very, very similar to the flow we've seen before, but this time we're talking about external server, right? And similar to before, the transparent arrows now are absolutely transparent to developer and user. So once again, developer only needs to care about making their initial WL resource request, handling possible challenge in his challenge handler, okay, and eventually getting the data. So the rest of the flows is actually transparent, absolutely transparent to developer. Okay, so let's see several scenarios, and I'll try to cover the same scenarios we've started with today. Okay, let's see several scenarios that actually, how auth can actually help to solve problems we've seen before. So let's start with basic scenario, okay? So client starts with a request. Okay, so in this scenario, we don't have authentication gateway. We're still working with firewall. Okay, so no authentication gateway, basic scenario. So client sends a request, okay, and that request is intercepted by authorization filter. Okay. So in this case, resource server can be either Java adapter or any Node.js or Liberty or WebSphere server inside of your enterprise. Okay, so that's the only thing important here. It's inside of your enterprise. So client makes a direct request to that service. Okay, the service is protected by authorization filter. So filter detects that this request is not authorized, this client is not authorized to access the resource server, and it returns HTTP for 1 plus scope that the client requires and actually to be able to access. So client go to MobileFirst server, ask for authorization for that specific scope. Okay. MobileFirst server returns challenges. Those challenges are processed by a challenge handler. Okay, regular standard MobileFirst challenge handler, nothing new there. Challenge handler eventually returns responses to MobileFirst platform. MobileFirst platform might go to authentication manager, user registry, or LDAP server, anything you might have inside of your infrastructure to validate those credentials received from challenge handlers. Okay, and eventually MobileFirst platform will create authorization header for that client. So client will make the original request again, this time with authorization header. The request will go through authorization filter since it has a valid authorization header. The header will be validated, right? And the data will be returned. Eventually, the data will be returned to the client. Okay, so what's different in this case? First of all, the research server knows everything about this user, this device, and this application. Authorization header contains all of that information, and regardless of the fact whether research server is Java adapter or third-party external server that runs Node.js, once it has authorization header, it knows everything about user, device, and application. Okay, so it doesn't need to worry about how to get user information from access token, the cookie that we've talked about in the beginning, right? So its life is much easier, and it's much easier for developers, for IT manager to actually add new servers. They don't need to teach each one of those how to actually do authentication and how to connect to user registries or anything like it. Okay, so you can just protect everything with a MobileFirst authorization filter, and it will take care of the rest. In addition, that research server now using authorization filter can report analytics. Okay, so authorization filter will automatically report analytics to MobileFirst platform. Okay, so once you use MobileFirst analytics dashboard, you will actually be able to see requests going to that resource server, be it either Java adapter or some Node.js, WebSphere, or Liberty server. So this is extremely convenient. Okay, you're getting for free here authentication, you're getting for free here security and analytics for your possibly external servers. And once again, from developer perspective, developer makes initial request, challenge handler might kick in case authentication is required, and eventually developer will get the data. Okay, the rest is absolutely internal, and developer doesn't need to worry about that. Okay. So let's take a look at a little bit more advanced scenario. So in this scenario, we actually have authentication gateway, right? Because a lot of different enterprises, especially big financial companies and big enterprises, they do require authentication gateway. That's the policy. And authentication gateway, as I've mentioned previously, does protect your internal infrastructure from unauthorized access. Okay, so the initial flow is pretty much the same as we've seen before. Request, login form, challenge handler authenticates, sends credentials. Those credentials are validated, and authentication gateway creates some kind of a cookie for that client, so it would be able to pass the authentication gateway. Right, let's see what happens next. So next, client makes request with that cookie to a resource server. Okay, so since cookie is there on a request, the request gets through the authentication gateway. Authorization filter intercepts that request and saying, hey, you might be authenticated to go through authentication gateway, but you're definitely not authorized to access resource server just yet. Okay, because gateways in most cases take care only about user authentication, and MobileFirst platform adds a lot on top of that by doing device authentication and application authentication, making sure that application is authentic, that it's not a fake or hacked application, okay, and that device is actually allowed to communicate with the internal infrastructure. Okay, so for now we only have user authentication, so this is definitely not enough for resource server. So resource server returns and authorization filter actually returns for 1 plus scope, similar, very similar to previous scenarios. So client goes to MobileFirst platform server asking for authorization information, authorization header, and request has scope and cookie. Cookie allows this request to go through authentication gateway, right? Once again, MobileFirst platform returns challenges. Challenge handler needs to enter, take care of those challenges. Challenge handler returns challenge response, and eventually MobileFirst platform will return authorization information or authorization header. So once authorization header is obtained by client, it will make original request. It will send original request again, this time with authorization header. Authorization filter will parse that authorization header and validate it and allow request to go through to the resource server, and resource server will return data. Okay, so similar to the previous scenario, authorization filter also knows how to report analytics to MobileFirst platform server. Now, you might notice that there are two challenge handlers here, okay? And you might be asking yourself, okay, so I'm already authenticated with the authentication gateway. Will this require my users to actually authenticate one more time when working with MobileFirst? And the answer is no. Okay, so once you're authenticated with your authentication gateway, you got your user authentication. Okay, so you're user-wise, you're authenticated. So now that you start to communicate with MobileFirst platform, okay, it will know how to process your user authentication, okay, similarly as to what we've been talking previously. But MobileFirst platform will also require your application and device to authenticate, okay? So in case your application and device authentication is transparent, and in most cases it is, okay, you will not see, a developer will not have to write a dedicated challenge handler, and user will not actually see anything, and everything will happen transparently in the background, and infrastructure, the MobileFirst platform SDK will take care of everything, right? But at this point, just to know, at this point, you might actually introduce another challenge handler to have some custom device authentication, okay? In case you're not, it's absolutely transparent. So, and since you're using authorization filter on your resource server, okay, once again, your resource server knows everything about this user, this device, and this application, okay? And of course, it can also report analytics. So if we take a look of what matters to developer here, in most cases, that's the initial request, okay, that the user makes, okay, and challenge handler needs to take care of actually processing login forms and credentials, okay, so challenge handler needs to do user authentication, but once you pass user authentication phase, all the rest of the flow gonna be automated. It's gonna be fully automatic, right? And eventually, resource server will return you the data you've asked for. Okay. So the last scenario we're going to cover is, of course, use an external resource server somewhere in the cloud. Okay, so it's similar. It's very similar. It starts with client making request to that external server in the cloud. Okay, so the external server in the cloud is protected by authorization filter. So it doesn't need to worry about how to authenticate users. It just knows that, hey, this request doesn't contain authorization information. That's it. I'm not letting it in. I'm returning for one, and I'm telling you want to get access, go get me authorization header for that specific scope. So client makes request to get this authorization information, and there is a gateway in the middle. Okay, so gateway returns a login form. It intercepts the client request to get authorization header and returns a login form. There is a challenge handler on the client side that knows how to take care of that, okay? So challenge handler obtains credentials and returns credentials to authentication gateway, just submits login form or does whatever is required. Authentication gateway knows how to validate those credentials with authentication manager or user registry of some kind like LDAP server. And eventually, authentication gateway will return a cookie, okay, to the client. So client, once again, asks for authorization. This time, the request has cookie. Since request has cookie, authentication gateway will let the request through all the way to the MobileFirst platform server. Similarly to previous scenarios, MobileFirst platform server will give you challenges, okay, and a different set of challenge handlers might be required here to answer those challenges and generate responses and return them to MobileFirst platform. Okay, that's MobileFirst platform here. That's your authorization server, and eventually you will get authorization header containing all the tokens from MobileFirst platform. Okay, so once again, the request from client will be made again to external resource server, this time with authorization information, and resource server will return you data since authorization filter will be able to validate that authorization header. So note that report analytics is not yet available, okay, so it will be available in the future, right, but currently it's not yet available for external servers that are outside of your enterprise. Okay, so important things. Your external server that sits somewhere in a cloud and has no idea what's going on inside of your enterprise. How do you authenticate users? What's the topology infrastructure? It doesn't know anything about your enterprise, but it still knows everything about your user, about device, and about application from authorization header. Okay, and one day it will be able to report analytics information. So if we take a look at the standard flow that we've seen here, client makes request. Okay, next thing, client knows challenge handler kicks in. Okay, because that's the way it was programmed. Okay, so client needs to take care in this user authentication challenge handler of actually gathering username and password from user and submitting them, sending them to authentication framework that will make the request, right? Next thing client knows, he's getting the data. Okay, and the second challenge handler, as in previous example, it is optional. So it's taking care of device and application authentication. In case you don't have any explicit custom device or application authentication, it will be absolutely transparent. Okay, so a lot of stuff is happening here, a lot of complex stuff that allows your external servers to actually get information about user, about device, about application, right? But developer doesn't need to worry about that, and user doesn't need to worry about that. From their perspective, it's absolutely seamless. It doesn't matter whether you invoke Java adapter. It doesn't matter whether you invoke Node.js server inside or outside of your enterprise. It doesn't matter if you use internal or external WebSphere or Liberty server. So the flow from developer and user perspective is absolutely the same. Okay, and we will see it once I do the demo. Okay, so several additional links. You can read more information about OAuth and MobileFirst platform OAuth. So OAuth is a spec, okay? And as a spec, it leaves a lot of space for custom implementation. So it tells how the authorization flow should work, but it leaves free space to actually implement authentication in various different ways. So that's why using MobileFirst platform authentication infrastructure, you can actually implement any kind of authentication you want. Okay, so you're not limited to any specific authentication type. You can read Knowledge Center articles, okay, and Knowledge Center actually gives a lot of good information about OAuth model, okay. You can use Getting Started modules. Those are tutorials, step-by-step tutorials how to actually achieve some functionality. So we have a tutorial for OAuth-based security model, and we have a tutorial for using MobileFirst server to authenticate external resources, okay. And you can also go and actually read the OAuth spec, okay. So this is a document that actually gives you full description of what OAuth is, okay, because I've still tried to keep it in a nutshell. So I think it's enough for theory, right? I think the next thing I will do is several demos of how this actually works.